Okay, so the next lesson is on the PFRS 13. So this is on the fair value measurement. So this fair value measurement, it is applicable to most of the transactions. If we're talking about mga assets, liabilities nga measurement, commonly ma-mention yun all about sa fair value. So, the standards that talks about the fair value measurement is PFRS 13. So, that's PFRS 13 fair value measurement. So, the content of this lesson is first we have the scope, and then we have the fair value. And then we also have about the market, fair value measurement, and the valuation methods and fair value hierarchy. So what is the scope of PFRS 13? So this applies to the fair value measurement and related disclosures of an asset, liability, or equity when other PFRS require measurement at fair value or fair value less cost to sell. Because most of the time, uh, maggamit yun ang mga fair values pag mag-transact, mamaligya, mamalit, mag-measure sa mga different nga mga assets, mag-measure pod sa different nga liability. So, gamit kaayo ang PFRS 13. So, what is a fair value? So, fair value refers to the exit price or market price under market conditions at a measurement date. It also refers to the price in an orderly transaction. So when we talk about orderly transaction, that is a transaction that allows for normal marketing activities that are usual and customary. Another also definition of this one is the price that is agreed by the market participants. So when we say fair value of an asset, so that means the price that would be received to sell an asset. So that's why it's called as an exit price, diba? Nigbaligya. Sell an asset in an orderly transaction between market participants. And the fair value of a liability would refer to the price that would be paid to transfer a liability in an orderly transaction between market participants. And who are these market participants? Diba? Gimension po ganiha, this is the price agreed by the market participants. So the market participants are the buyers and the sellers in the principal market who are independent or unrelated parties, knowledgeable or having a reasonable understanding of the transaction, and it could also be those who are willing or motivated but not forced and compelled to enter into the transaction. Then we will proceed to the market. Okay. So in the market, there would be fair valuation. Okay? So na fair valuation, unya, we need to determine the fair valuation under the active market. Okay? So fair value measurement requires assumptions based on the current market conditions. It assumes that the transaction to sell the asset or transfer the liability takes place either in the principal market for the asset or liability or the most advantageous market for the asset or liability in case there's no principal market. Then we have the active market. So the active market is a market in which transactions for the asset or liability take place with sufficient regularity and volume to provide pricing information on an ongoing basis. It's just like kanang normal nga merkado, di ba, nga naay daghan kayong transactions. Okay? So, it is an active market if daghan kayo siya volume of transaction. Then, we mentioned earlier that there would be a principal market. So, pwedeng mag-base ta sa ato ang fair valuation on the principal market. So, the principal market is a market with the greatest volume and level of activity for the asset or liability. If there's no principal market, the entity will consider the most advantageous market. And what is this most advantageous market? This is the market that maximizes the amount that would be received to sell the asset or minimizes the amount that could be paid to transfer the liability. Generally, the market that an entity enters when it sells an asset or transfers a liability is the principal market or the most advantageous market. So how do we measure the fair value? So we need to determine first the market price. So the market price, whether based on the principal or the most advantageous market, is used in measuring the fair value. And this is not adjusted for any transaction cost, but will be adjusted for any transport cost. What are the transaction costs? So, di ba, we mentioned, di ba nga, dili ni siya adjustan sa transaction cost. So, to know kung unsa man tong mga cost ang dili nato i-appeal sa consideration sa ato ang fair value. So, dapat kabalo ta unsa tong mga transaction cost nga walay labot unya unsa man tong mga transport cost nga labot sa consideration sa fair value. First, we have the transaction costs. So transaction costs are costs to sell an asset or to transfer a liability in the principal or most advantageous market for the asset or liability that are directly attributable to the disposal of the asset or the transfer of the liability and meet both of the following criteria. They result directly from and are essential to the transaction, and they would not have been incurred by the entity had a decision to sell the asset or transfer the liability not been made. Okay? So, para ma-consider siya nga transaction cost, dapat gikan gid siya adto nga transaction sa pagpamaligya. Ikaduha, kung walay pagpamaligya, di unta na siya ma-incur. So, kung kana nga cost, ma-incur na siya kung mamaligya, pero di ma-incur kung di mamaligya, then it is a transaction cost. Again, ang sa tong gingon ganiha, the market price used in measuring the fair value is not adjusted for any transaction cost. So therefore, kung may transaction cost adto, wala to siya labot sa pag-measure sa fair value. Ang ma-appeal ra sa consideration kay ang transport costs. And what are transport costs? So if location is a characteristic of the asset, for example, for a commodity, the price in the principal or most advantageous market is reduced by the transport costs when measuring the fair value. So transport costs are costs that would be incurred to transport an asset from its current location to its principal or most advantageous market. So kana ara ang maapil sa consideration. Okay, so the formula to get the fair value, if we have the market price from the principal or the most advantageous market, would be market price minus the transport costs. And that would be our fair value. For example, an entity or this entity A has an asset that is required under a PFRS to be measured at fair value. The asset is sold in two different active markets. Entity A has access to both of these markets. Information of these markets is shown below. So we have active market 1, active market 2. Then we have the market prices for active market 1 and 2, transaction costs, and the transport costs. Case 1, if active market 1 is the principal market for the asset, how much is the fair value of the asset? Sa to'y rule, para ma-determine ang fair value, you're going to adjust for the transaction costs. Sorry, you're going to adjust for the transport cost, but not for transaction cost. Again, to get the fair market value, you're going to adjust for the transport costs, but not for the transaction costs. So therefore, since active market 1 is identifiable as the principal market, then we're going to use the price in active market 1. Okay, di ba sa priority, ang principal market ang ato ang unahon. Kung walay principal market, we will identify which of the markets is considered as the most advantageous market. So again, since active market 1 is a principal market, we will use the market price for active market 1. So that's 130. And again, di ba, we will going to adjust for the transport cost. So deduct the transport cost of 10. So therefore, the fair market value that we will use is 120. Okay? Again, this is if the principal market is available or identifiable. Okay. What if, okay, this is case 2 already. If neither market, okay, edit sana ko ha. Okay. What if neither of the market is the principal market for the asset? So, walay principal market between the two. So, how much would be the fair value of the asset? So, in this case, we need to identify the most advantageous market. So, how do we determine the most advantageous market? We need to consider here the transaction cost to identify the most advantageous market. But again, we will not adjust for the transport cost. We will not adjust for the transportation. We will not again. Balik ta. Again, we will not adjust for the transaction cost when we are determining na the fair value. But for determining the most advantageous market, apilon si transaction cost. Kay kinahanglan man ta mamili sa duha. Unya ako ma-identify na si most advantageous market, saka nato kwaon or gamiton ang market price adto nga market and determine the fair value. So how do we determine the most advantageous market? So we will include in the computation our transaction costs. So we have for market 1, 130 minus 15 minus 10, that would be 105. Then active market 2, 125 minus 5 minus 10, that's 110. So therefore, which of the two is our most advantageous market? So the most advantageous market would be the market nga mas dako og amount nga ma-receive from the sale. So between the two, mas dako man si active market 2, so therefore the most advantageous market is active market 2. Pero ang kanibang 110 ang fair value, the answer is no. Dili na mao ang fair market value. So i-compute pa nato na siya. Okay? So active market 2 is the most advantageous market because the sale proceeds is higher. But how do we compute the fair market value? So the fair market value here would be, okay, price in active market 2, which is 125, minus 10, and that would be 115. So again, dili na to i-apil ang transaction cost. Ang transaction cost maapil lang kung kwaon na to ang proceeds from the sale. Okay? And then kung asa mas dako ang proceeds sa sale, mao to ang ang atong i-identify as the most advantageous market, and from there kuhaon nato ang price and i-deduct ang transport cost. So that's why nga Ang fair value nga gamiton kay 115. So, transport cost gihapon ang gamiton. So, disregard the transaction cost in getting the fair value. Then how about for non-financial assets? So when determining the fair value of non-financial assets, an entity considers the asset's highest and best use in addition to the other requirements of PFRS 13. Then what is this highest and best use? This is the use of the non-financial asset by market participants that would maximize the value of an asset. So the highest and best use of the non-financial asset should possess the following. So we have physically possible. It reflects the physical characteristics of an asset. Legally permissible. It reflects any legal restrictions on the use of the asset. And financially feasible. It reflects whether the use would generate sufficient income or cash flows. So the highest and best use of the asset might provide maximum value either on a standalone basis or as a group in combination with other asset and liability. Now we proceed to the valuation methods and the fair value hierarchy. So there are three valuation techniques that can be used to measure the fair value. We have the market approach, we have the income approach, and the cost approach. So market approach uses prices and relevant information for market transactions for identical and comparable asset and liability. So magamit siya sa market transactions. If it is income approach, it uses the discounted cash flows. So, pag muhis ko tag discounted cash flow, this means that the cash flows in the future cash flows will be multiplied with the present value factors to get the discounted value or the present value of the future cash flows. So, magamit itong mga PV factors. If we're using cost approach, we're using the current replacement cost to replace the asset with a comparable asset. Then we have the fair value hierarchy. Okay, so we have level 1, 2, 3 inputs. So when we talk about hierarchy, this means that naa siya levels, naa siya priority. Diba? Kung naa siya sa level 1, maunay una natong i-consider. Okay? So the value hierarchy or best evidence of fair value is enumerated as follows. So, kani ang una natong pangitaon kung magdetermine ta sa fair valuation. Are there any observable inputs that reflect quoted prices for identical assets or liability in the active market? So, mao na yung una na tong pangitaon. And that would be the most reliable nga source of fair market value. So, a quoted price in an active market provides the most reliable evidence of fair value and shall be used without adjustments. In the absence of level 1, we can proceed to level 2. So, these are inputs that are observable either directly or indirectly. Okay. Inputs other than quoted prices included in level 1 that are observable for the asset either directly or indirectly through corroboration with observable data. And this include the quoted prices for similar assets or liability in an active market or an inactive market, or quoted prices for identical asset or liability in an inactive market. Okay? So, remember that sa may kalahian niya aning level 1 nga input. So, sa level 1 input, quoted price for identical asset in active markets. active market. Identical asset or liability niya active ang market. Nya tanaw ninyo ang level 2, similar similar assets sa active market or inactive market. So, active market siya or inactive pero similar lang, dili identical. Pagabot diri, identical siya pero ang market kay inactive. Kay kung nahimo ni siyang active market, then that's a level 1 input. Pero wala siya mo meet sa identical and then active market. Only identical but inactive. Kani active pero similar lang. If wala gihapoy level 2, then we proceed to level 3. These are unobservable inputs. Okay, for example, an entity's own data or assumption. So these are developed by the entity using the best available information from the entity's own data. And this will include present value of estimated cash flows. And this would be the least reliable nga source or price for the price to be considered as fair value. Okay? So, kani ang pinakauna, pinaka-reliable, and this will be the least reliable. Okay? So, that's the end of our lesson for fair value measurement. If you like this video, don't forget to click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be updated with the latest video lessons. Thank you for watching.